There are many misconceptions related to how autistic individuals interact socially. The most effective way to support an autistic adult is to understand autism.
I see trees of green, red roses too. I see them bloom for me and for you. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world.
Hi, I'm Amanda Wroten. I'm the Director of Safety on the Spectrum for the Autism Society of America.
My name is Judy Ogden. I live at North Olmsted, Vitalia, near Cleveland, Ohio. I am the grandmother of an autistic adult, and I am interested in autism because of him especially. I have a question. How can autism affect adults and seniors?
So, autism is a developmental condition that typically appears in early childhood, but it remains throughout the lifespan. So, if you're an autistic adult, you spend the least amount of your lifespan as an autistic child. And we like to remind people of that because many times people consider autism to be something that you'll grow out of or it's a childhood issue. It's a lifespan developmental condition. And while autism can impact everybody differently, there's a lot of shared characteristics and experiences that impact communication, information sharing, sensory processing, social interactions, relationships, and emotional regulation. And that happens at every age. There's over 5.4 million autistic adults in the United States. And just like everybody else, just like me and you, people with autism move through significant life changes. And there's a need for more research in adult autism, not just learning about the number of seniors, but learning more about aging within the autism community.
Well, how does autism differ in children and adults?
That's a great question. Autism is referred to as a spectrum condition. It impacts people differently. So not only is there a difference between a child and an adult, but there's a difference between the type of autism that your son might have or somebody else that you might encounter with autism. For example, autism can occur with or without intellectual disabilities. Some people with autism will remain non-speaking throughout their lifetime, while others are actually hyperverbose. Some people experience sensory difficulties, both as children and then also when they become adults. And while others may experience changes in their processing time, so how long it takes them to answer a question, to actually process that information that you're giving me, just like the question you just asked. There are some examples of ways that a person's needs will change from one person to another throughout the lifespan. There's also one key difference between children and adults with autism, and that's the access to services and support. So when I heard you say this question, it was the immediate thing that came to mind for me. Young adults and seniors with autism experience what is commonly referred to as the service cliff. This is a stark drop in services like therapy, interventions, schools, programs, individuals who age out of early interventional programs or they're done with school-based programs, so K through 12, they make up the largest portion of service delivery in the United States. And that's one of the biggest ways that autism in kids and autism in adults really differs is the access to services and support. As we learn more about autism and screening and diagnosis efforts, there are growing numbers of individuals who are diagnosed with autism in adulthood. This is a more common than not scenario that we see as a late in life diagnosis. And while early interventional services are critical, adults with autism may need additional support. They need help finding employment. They need help finding housing, healthcare, and their relationships.
What are some of the common misconceptions that people have about autistic adults, especially?
Absolutely. So I mentioned earlier the first one, right? Outgrowing our autism, outgrowing the diagnosis. As I mentioned earlier, it's a lifespan condition. Autism is going to be something that stays with you for your entire life. And many individuals develop coping mechanisms such as masking, which is the process of suppressing our artistic traits or behaviors in an effort to kind of fit in, if you will, with societal norms or expectations that people have with us. Masking involves mimicking behaviors, social cues, and basically trying to present ourselves as non-autistic in order to kind of blend in. Outside of the autism community, there are many misconceptions related to how autistic individuals interact socially. One of the big ones that comes to mind for me is a lack of empathy. We hear that a lot, that autistic individuals lack empathy. And that's absolutely a misconception. Autistic individuals experience and express empathy just like you and I do, but it might just look a little different in the way that neurotypicals express it. And I want to go back to masking for a second. When you mentioned that, while masking can like help us interact in social settings, so it'll help us suppress those autistic behaviors. We kind of blend in a little bit more. We fly under the radar. It can be a good tool, right? But it does have really negative consequences. Constantly being able to suppress who I am, to suppress my natural self, can lead to extra stress, anxiety, can lead to burnout, etc.
So, what is sensory processing?
Sensory processing. So sensory processing, or what might be referred to as sensory integration, is how our brain recognizes and makes sense of all of the information coming in our environment. So imagine being on a busy street corner. You're leaving your home, you're going outside, you're going to catch the bus, you're going to go to your car, there's traffic, there's the noise of that, there could be sirens, the light could be shining if you've ever been driving the car and the light's flashing in your eyes because the sun's there. There's lots of stimuli, lots of information coming in. And individuals with autism tend to filter incoming sensory messages, or what we call sensory input, a little bit differently. Some types of input may be processed too big. So for instance, something that doesn't really seem loud to you might be incredibly loud to your son. It could be even overwhelming to the point that you can ignore it and have a regular conversation. But for your son, it's too much information coming in, and it's too loud and it's too quick, and it becomes really, really overwhelming. Other input can be processed so small that a person can barely detect it. We hear commonly that autistic individuals forget to eat, aren't sure that they need to go to the bathroom, take care of basic things that we might consider normal to us, because that sensory input that's coming in, that signal in their body, tells them that they can barely detect it. That's how sensory processing can be a little different. And that sensory overload, when information comes in too big, too much, etc., that's common phenomenon that we see across children, adults with autism. You develop coping strategies, but it doesn't necessarily change how sensitive you are to that stimuli coming in, because it can be very distressing to be in sensory overload, even triggering your body's fight or flight response. Every person's got a unique sensory profile. So some things that bother one person may not bother your son. And therapy can help with this. Occupational therapists or professionals who provide sensory evaluation, sensory integration therapy, recommendations can help you develop those coping strategies. Some things are really simple too. So for instance, if I go to see a movie with my husband, it's very, very loud in there. If we go to a really nice theater, he enjoys that. He likes feeling that vibration of sound and everything. But for me, it's just slightly too much. And I keep a little pair of foam headphones in my backpack and I put them in my ears, and we both get to enjoy the movie at the same time. So there's lots of little things that we can do to help with those sensory issues, but we never really get rid of them. And finally, the Autism Society, we're developing a national training series to help educate people in our community, as well as caregivers, first responders, etc., about what autism is, including things like these sensory processing issues, so that we can understand those differences and help increase our learning.
One of the things I noticed about my grandson is if sensory changes happen fast, it's difficult for him.
Yeah, and I'll be remiss if I didn't mention earlier, I'm on the spectrum. I was diagnosed with ADHD as a kid and then found out I was on the spectrum as an adult. It becomes like a bucket for me personally, where it's bothering me, it's bothering me, it's bothering me. And then all of a sudden, I can't cope with it. Or your son might experience where some days he can cope with it or mask or develop those coping mechanisms, and other days he just doesn't have the capacity to do that.
What are some of the most effective ways that we can support an autistic adult?
The most effective way to support an autistic adult is to just understand autism. So often we get this conception of what autism is based on a definition we might have seen 30 or 40 years ago. It could be off of a TV show. But to really understand what autism is to do some research. Please go to the Autism Society website, autismsociety.org. We have lots of great information on what autism is. But understanding what autism is the very baseline of supporting somebody. It helps you understand each individual characteristic that can manifest with autism and then work to support them. Self-advocacy is another important key to this, as well as self-determination. We want individuals with autism to develop social relationships, just like you need social relationships. It's important for people with autism to let others know what they need, so to feel comfortable and to feel an environment where they're understood, where they can trust the other person and express what it is they need, even if that takes a little bit longer for them to express that. They also want to be able to express what makes them happy or uncomfortable, just like everybody else. Often people are willing to respect these differences if they simply know about them. So if an autistic individual is willing to share that they're autistic, that support can start immediately just through shared understanding. Second, misconceptions make it harder. We talked about this earlier, right? All of these misconceptions about individuals with autism not having empathy, etc. That makes it really harder for people who are autistic to make and keep friends. Differences in our neurobiology for those with autism may mean automatically picking up, incorporating, and effectively using elusive and transient social information. It's more difficult for us. This information or this hidden curriculum that happens in social interactions can be really overwhelming for an autistic individual. Unwritten social rules that are vague or confusing, for instance, arriving at a party exactly at 7 o'clock if it starts at 7 o'clock, whereas many people that have been to parties years and years know that it's appropriate to come a little bit fashionably late, as we might call it. Those unwritten social cues are so confusing for autistic individuals. So getting social experience, discussing rules, joining classes, support programs, things like that, these teach great ways to understand social interactions that might be, difficult to understand for somebody with autism. And it helps to clarify any sort of hidden curriculum and make social interactions easier and really more rewarding. And then third, many friendships are based on similarities, right? We stay friends with those people in our circle that have similar interests, similar experiences, and many people with autism have a particularly strong interest in certain areas. So clubs where people are interested in the exact same thing, whether it's, your knitting club, your crochet club, you're doing genealogy with a club, you're doing pickleball, etc. Clubs where people have the same interests and are likely to gather are excellent places for connecting with others and finding friends. You could also participate in volunteering, whether it's at a museum, workshop, zoo, animal rescue, etc. And there's no really one size fits all technique for working and connecting with a person. This isn't any different than you connecting with somebody that doesn't have autism, right? We're all different in how we proceed with those social interactions. But when it comes from the heart, when it's genuine care, when it's genuine curiosity from a place of just wanting to love somebody, to want to accept them and help them, that authentic approach is so valuable in supporting adults with autism. It allows them to be their authentic self without judgment and taps into their world in a way that you can get to know them.
My grandson had a way of trying to reduce anxiety by drumming.
Ah,
And it can be annoying, especially if you're in a restaurant and he decides that he's nervous about too many selections on the menu, that he might start drumming. He doesn't use the utensils, he just uses his hands.
so we
Are there
call
other ways to do it?
Yeah, so what he's doing, that drumming, I'll give you a term that you can use now. It's called stimming. And what that is self-soothing to him and his anxiety or any sort of issue he's experiencing. So if it's a new situation, you mentioned exactly with the menu, I personally need to look that up ahead of time and go and select my meal choice before we show up to make it easy. So I identify with that. But that drumming that you're talking about, it's called stimming. And stimming does actually help to reduce anxiety. It helps to do something that we call self-regulation. And I'll give you an example. Let me reach here. So many people are familiar with fidget spinners and different things like that. That drumming replicates that. But just to let you know how normal it is for us to stim, you've probably met somebody that clicks a pen all the time or likes to play with their hair, or, those sorts of things that we consider normal, but drumming on the table is not, it's all stimming. It's just a way for us to self-regulate. And while it can be distracting in certain environments, allowing an autistic person to stim is really good for them self-regulating and for reducing anxiety. Because autistic individuals have more than a threefold higher rate of suicide and suicide attempt than the general population. So anxiety is a huge issue that we see in the autism community. Our recent data shows that people with autism have less access to healthcare, meaning they might not be getting mental health supports, and they're at increased risk for co-occurring medical or mental health conditions, and having more anxiety and more depression than people that don't have disabilities. Living in a place that's not built for you, that's not built for your needs, that doesn't meet your sensory needs can contribute to these mental issues. And experiencing social stigma or isolation, being repeatedly misunderstood, held to a norm or convention that you don't understand or doesn't resonate with you, and then living with those unmet sensory needs. So for instance, that soothes him, as you mentioned, but if we don't allow him to do that, we have an unmet sensory need. So living with unmet sensory needs or unmet communication needs or inadequate support can increase anxiety that somebody's experiencing if they're autistic. We're learning a lot more about autism and trauma as well, about the importance of mental health services for individuals. I strongly recommend finding a therapist who understands neurodiversity and the intersection of autism and other mental health issues or mental health needs. That is really key. I also recommend, and we recommend as an organization, incorporating mindfulness and breathing exercises. Those are absolutely wonderful. I saw some of the meditation videos that are on the YouTube channel. Those are great examples of activities that you can support. And if you or a loved one or someone is in crisis, there are options available to help you cope. You can call the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline at any time to speak to someone and get support. And that support is confidential. It's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
What happens if an adult has never been diagnosed with autism and it's just thought of as that's just Jimmy or something like that, as opposed to maybe there's something that should be looked into further?
Right. So we hear that all the time, right? That one Uncle Bob is just, that's how Uncle Bob is. And there's no further information on that. In the time that I've been in this position, the Centers for Disease Control has changed what we call the prevalence rate, or the rate that an individual is diagnosed, since I've been here in just the past year. So I'll give you an example. When I started, in January of 2023, 1 in 54 individuals were diagnosed with autism. 1 in 54 children is the statistic. It's now 1 in 32. And it's not that that number is going up because something's wrong. It's that more people are getting diagnosed. And it's not unusual to see these late in life diagnoses happen. So it's really important to get diagnosed. But one of the things that we find is many adults report difficulty in finding someone to diagnose them as an adult with autism. In some cases, diagnosticians only focus on children. This is very, very common. So somebody seeks out an autism diagnosis, but they're an adult and they have trouble finding somebody that will diagnose them as an adult because many of the services are geared towards children and early intervention. In other cases that we find, professionals feel less qualified to diagnose adults as they present differently. So for instance, when you're an adult, your son, for example, you've had the opportunity and time and wherewithal to develop coping strategies, right? I remember as a kid, if I don't fit in with this group of girls because I'm doing these things, it makes sense to me as a people-pleasing female to stop doing those things so that I fit in, right? So we develop those coping mechanisms as an adult. And we find that it can be hard for diagnosticians. They feel less qualified to diagnose an adult because of those nuances that are happening. As the presentation can be different, that masking can really change that. And it can be complicated by a person's life history and co-occurring medical conditions, and professional training for diagnosing adults is just simply more limited.
There's one other thing that it's my grandson. He's autistic. His IQ level is in the low 70s. Does that intellectual lower IQ, Plus, are there any other emotional things that sometimes sidle up with autism?
Sure, absolutely. So the IQ piece that you mentioned may or may not occur. If we look at the diagnostic criteria for autism, there's 3 levels of autism: autism 1, 2, and 3. Um, Individuals with autism 1 typically do not have any impact in that area that we're discussing, but individuals that are in autism 2 or 3 may have intellectual disability. So intellectual disabilities often co-occur with autism, but they don't have to. As I mentioned earlier, I think it was one of the first questions that we talked about. Some people with autism will remain non-speaking their entire life. Others could be hyper-verbose. I'm a college professor. So it's very different for each person.
My grandson happens to be empathetic, but very slow in reacting to questions, or uh, if a change happens quickly, it's upsetting.
Yes. So we do these things. You mentioned coping strategies. There's this concept called a social story. And we kind of do that for ourselves. If I'm going to fly to the airport, I go through that mental checklist of I've got to drive here, I got to park there, do I have my things packed? But reducing the anxiety around new things, because of individuals with autism often find comfort in their routines. We can use things like social stories to help mitigate that. So a social story would be a very, very simple set of language cues that would say, today we're going to the restaurant. It may be a little loud. You can take your headphones. When we get there, you're going to be able to order your favorite meal, which is a club sandwich. We'll be there for about an hour. And when it's time to go, we'll say thank you. We'll sack our plates, we'll pay the check, and we will get in the car and come home. On the way home, we'll stop at the park so we can see the ducks. That's a social story. And telling somebody what's coming next, you know that already from being a person. We always want to know what's coming next. That's why when we go to meetings, there's agenda. When we go to a ceremony, there's, the playbill they hand you of what's going to happen. So using a social story can reduce anxiety about what's coming next when those routines have to change suddenly.
Well, that's pretty much all I can think of. Can you add anything that I should have asked?
Oh, sure. I think the big thing for me is the thing that I want people to know is that we're getting ready to go into Autism Acceptance Month, which is April. The whole month of April is a great opportunity to learn more about autism. As I mentioned, you can go to our website, autismsociety.org. We've got great resources there. We also have a network of 70 affiliates across the country. So we are likely very close to wherever you or your loved one lives. And we would love to have you be a part of our community as well as share resources for you. Because our overall goal is to create a more inclusive and accepting community during Autism Month. Our organization's mission is to create connections to everyone in the autism community, whether it's somebody diagnosed with autism, a loved one, a caregiver, so that they can have the resources they need to live fully. And that website's full of information. And then the last thing that I'll share with you, Judy, is sometimes you just want to reach out and talk to somebody. Sometimes you have questions that Google cannot answer. And we're here to help people get connected. You can connect with us on the phone at the Autism Society's national helpline. We're here to help you provide information. We have information and referral specialists. You can call 1-800-3-AUTISM. That's 1-800-328-8476. And one of our information and referral specialists will create a case for you and help you fill that need. It could be something as simple as your loved one's having a lot of issues right now because they can't get access to dental care because there's no dentist in your area that knows how to deal with their sensory accommodations or can be patient with them enough on an appointment. Those are the type of questions that we can answer by finding you a dentist that has autism training that can help your son get in and get dental care. So please feel free to call us at 800-3-AUTISM, 800-328-8476. And then all during April, I challenge everybody, go to the Autism Society of America website, autismsociety.org, and learn a little bit about autism.
Thank you. You've been most informative and
Aw,
helpful.
thank
You
you,
very
Judy.
much.
I had a great time talking to you.
Thank you.
And I think to myself,